Hello, welcome to today's unique collaboration among the City Club of Boise, Boise Metro Chamber of Commerce, Association of Idaho Cities, and Smith+Malek Law Firm. Our virtual conversation, Striving for Civility in Fractured Times, is an opportunity for our organizations to come together, to find common ground and move forward collaboratively in the spirit of collaboration. I'm Dr. Katherine Himes, City Club of Boise board member, director of the University of Idaho McClure Center for Public Policy Research, and today's moderator. We are honored to have so many organizations sponsoring this collaborative project. Our presenting sponsors are Northwest Nazarene University, the University of Idaho Boise, Dawson Taylor Coffee, and Idaho Central Credit Union. Our organizations also receive support from AARP Idaho, Bank of Idaho, Climatech Corporation, Echelon Group, Micron, Pacific Source Health Plans, Small Mine Development, St. Luke's Health System, Power Engineers, and Erstad Architects. City Club of Boise receives grant funding from the Idaho Humanities Council. Finally, thank you to our media partners, which include Boise State Public Radio, 670 KBOI, Idaho Statesman, Idaho Education News, Idaho Press, and Idaho Public Television. We'd like to start today's program with some opening remarks and a welcome sent home from Africa from Idaho entrepreneur and philanthropist Greg Carr.
Well, I'd like to say hello to the Boise City Club, and I'd like to thank Greg Hahn for inviting me to say a few words today. I'm actually standing in Africa. What you see behind me is Gorongosa National Park in Mozambique. I spend about half my time here and half my time in Idaho. Here in Gorongosa, I have a wonderful team of about 1,000 Mozambicans, and we're restoring wildlife to this national park. We're working in the communities next door with schools and with healthcare. But today, I'm actually going to talk about Idaho. I'm not going to talk about Africa. Greg and I and a group of people have been involved in a conversation for more than a year now about a very sensitive topic. How can we bring Idahoans together? How can we bring a divided United States together? Now, I've been pretty sad the last few years, and I suspect all of you feel the same way. Watching half of America fighting with half of America, and it's divisive and it's unpleasant, and we're all kind of asking ourselves, what's going on, and why aren't we having a more civil conversation, and can we come together? Well, I think the answer is yes. We can come together. Now the question is there a set of Idaho values, American values? Well, first things first. What are Idaho values? Well, for me, I'm going to go back to my grandparents. Those happen to be the same grandparents of Senator Michael Crapo, because his mom and my mom are sisters, and he and I are first cousins. In 1912, Hannah Marie Sandberg, a woman of Swedish descent, came to Kimberly with Niels Albert Olson, my grandfather, and started a farm. They had 80 acres. They had a little white farmhouse. In fact, we have a photo of that white farmhouse. My mom and I went back to see it a couple years ago. It's still standing over 100 years later. They had some chickens and they had some cows. And this is the beginning of where I learned Idaho values, from listening to my mother talk about her childhood. And what are those values? First of all, self-reliance. This was a family that had 8 children. My mom was number 8. They had to take care of themselves. They made most of their own food. My mom, as a little child, would have to go out early in the freezing morning in the winter and get the eggs. She said she didn't like doing that because the chickens would scratch her and things like that. But she did it because she's part of this family. My mom talked about milking the cow, and then they would make butter, right, from the milk. And they had an old-fashioned churn, right? And you know how those work. You pumped it like this, up and down. And she said each of the kids would have to take a turn with 50 pumps to make butter. They made most of their own clothing. And they loved each other, and that's another Idaho value, compassion. They cared about each other. At night, my grandfather would tell stories about Denmark. All the kids would pile in bed, and he'd start into a story, and my mom says, of course, she'd fall asleep, and the next thing she knew it was morning. But they didn't just care about each other. They cared about their neighbors. They cared about everybody. Now, my mother was born in 1922. That means she was a child during the Depression, right? 1929, 1930, 1931. She's a little girl. She said many a day there'd be a knock on the back door. Now, it's not as if my grandparents had a lot of extra, trying to raise 8 kids, but that didn't matter. They would share something, some bread, some cheese, some milk, an apple, whatever. This was to a complete stranger. My mother told me that in her entire childhood, she never heard her father raise his voice. Now, he was a strong guy. He had to be tough to run a farm. In the summer, you're outdoors all day. In the winter, you're fixing your equipment. My grandfather was a carpenter, so he could make chairs and furniture, some of which we still have. My grandmother, imagine her old black potbelly stove, heating the entire house with that, doing all the cooking, taking care of everything in the household. It wasn't as if life was easy, but they worked through challenges without losing their composure. Now, I think everybody knows that in the United States, women got the right to vote in 1920. My grandmother, Hannah Marie Sandberg, was born in 1880. That means she was 40 years old before she had the right to vote in America. And let me tell you how my grandparents felt about voting. My mom explains that on election day, my grandparents would dress in their Sunday best clothing. And they would make all the children get dressed in their Sunday best clothing, even though, of course, the kids were too young to vote. And they would all go together as a family to the Kimberly High School gym. And the kids would all sit there, and Grandma and Grandpa would each take their turn going in and voting. Now imagine the different message that would have sent my mom of inclusiveness and her own place in society if she were only watching her dad vote and not her mom vote. That was a message to my mom. Well, my mom grew up and met my dad in Pocatello, Idaho. At that time, it was not called Idaho State University. It was the southern branch of the University of Idaho. My mom says that when she first saw Dad, she actually kind of thought that he was a bit of a clown. I'm sure he was. But she also thought that he kind of seemed smart and maybe kind of cute. So my mom chased him at something called Sadie Hawkins Day. Don't know if any of you have ever heard of it, but Sadie Hawkins Day, the girl goes out and picks her husband. And they got married. Well, shortly after that, America entered World War II. And my father didn't wait to be drafted. He walked up the courthouse steps and enlisted in the Navy. Taylor Carr. He became a captain of a Liberty ship. Now, you all probably know that 1/3 of the Liberty ships in World War II were sunk. Well, my father passed away in 2009. And we had a service in Idaho Falls, Idaho. And then we were out at the cemetery for that moment when you have the casket and you're actually going to lower the casket into the ground. And something happened that I consider one of the most sacred days of my life. 6 men appeared in uniform. I don't know where they came from. I don't even know who sends out the message or how this happens. 6 veterans wearing uniforms, standing in a line. And the first one was holding an American flag, folded. And they marched up to my mother, and they handed her that flag. Because he served his country. And she also served her country. She spent 3 years keeping the family together, and working, earning money. So those are Idaho values: service, hard work, self-reliance, compassion, caring about your family, caring about a stranger, giving when you don't really have anything to give, but also fairness. Fairness is an American value. It's fair that women get to vote, isn't it? Some of the American dream we're still fighting for. We're not quite finished achieving our dream of fairness. So my mom and dad, Taylor Carr and Betty Olson Carr, had 7 children in Idaho Falls, Idaho. I was the last one. My older brother, Phil, had a daughter named Alexandra. So let's talk about the next generation now. So Alexandra is the granddaughter of my mom, the great-granddaughter of Hannah Marie and Niels Albert from Kimberly. Alexandra is 18. She just graduated from Idaho Falls High School. She played softball on the varsity team. She was the pitcher. Now just imagine how wonderful that was for her, the self-confidence and the friendship. Alexandra got a scholarship to college to play softball. Now nobody in our family has ever got a scholarship before to play sports in college. I got a photo here of Alexandra hugging my mom right before one of her games. Now, when I was a little boy at Longfellow Elementary in Idaho Falls, Idaho, I remember thinking at the time, 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade, I thought, you know, boys do things and girls watch. And I wondered about that, but that's what it seemed like. Boys played basketball and girls watched, or boys played baseball and girls watched. Well, we all know that changed, didn't it? Our entire mindset changed. And we had Title IX, and we had fairness in school sports. So Alexandra had a softball team to choose from, or a volleyball team to choose from, or basketball at Idaho Falls High School. Alexandra grew up just assuming that she would have all these opportunities. She grew up in a world where you didn't assume that boys did things and girls watched. So that's progress. Once again, Title IX and the entire mindset changed of what girls and women do. That's progress in the unfinished American dream of fairness, equality. We all believe in it, it's a common value, but there's work to be done. I had a friend in junior high, his name was Keith. Keith and I went to Boy Scout camp together more than once. We had a lot of fun. Running around with hatchets. Now, I don't know who thought this was a good idea to give a bunch of 12-year-old boys hatchets, but anyway, we all had hatchets, and we're all chopping things. And somebody chopped the water main of the camp, and we had our own little Yellowstone geyser. And we had no more water for the rest of that camp except what we got from the creek, but that was okay. But Keith was the kind of guy who would be climbing a tree and having fun and fastest runner. Well, unfortunately, Keith was in a hunting accident in junior high. Bird hunting, he got hit in the back with a shotgun. Keith spent the rest of his life in a wheelchair. He's had a good life. We have something else in America called the ADA, right? The Americans with Disabilities Act. What did that mean? Well, it meant a lot of things. One of them is that public buildings have a ramp for wheelchair access. My little Carr Foundation in Idaho Falls, our tiny little building, we have a ramp where, so if Keith came to visit me, he could come in the building with dignity, just like I do, and not have someone pulling him upstairs backwards in his wheelchair. So the ADA is another example of American pushing forward to fairness for everybody, taking into account that any one of us could have a disability. Another example of where we agree on the underlying value, but there's work to be done. So there's my grandmother voting, there's my mother voting, there's my niece playing softball in high school, there's my buddy Keith being able to go in and out of public buildings. Well, my mother also takes the right to vote seriously and respectfully. On election day, she's the first one up, she gets dressed, she goes across the street to a school where we vote, and she votes. Now, I'll tell you something. In my entire life, I've never heard one time my mother say whether she's a Republican or a Democrat. In fact, in my entire life, I've never heard my mother say one time what her parents were, my grandparents that you've been hearing about. Now, I know my mother's values. I know my grandparents' values. But think about that. How could you possibly sum up your entire worldview, your entire philosophy of life in one word? Oh, well, I'm this or I'm that. Doesn't that seem a little simplistic? And this is what we've been talking about in Idaho for the past year, a group of us, how unfortunate it is and how silly it is that we're all divided. Instead of finding the common values upon which we can agree and upon which we can continue to have debate and discussion and even disagree, but do it in a civilized way. Now, Mom never told me who she voted for because it's a secret ballot, but I know how much work she put into it. She would study those candidates at the kitchen table, and she would learn about them. And I do know that she looked for character. She didn't look for a little letter after a name. She looked for character. Now, to wrap up, let's move to the next generation. We had a big family wedding this summer. And here's a photo of me with my great niece, Liv. So that's now the great-granddaughter of my mom, Betty, and the great-great-granddaughter of my grandparents, Hannah and Niels. Liv is either telling me a secret or refusing to tell me a secret or thinks Great Uncle Greg smells funny or something. But here's what I do know about Liv. She's part of an extended family of people that will love her, There's about 50 of us, all of the descendants of Mom and Dad. They get together on Christmas and 4th of July. And we don't all agree, but we all love each other and we respect each other and we can talk about things. Liv is going to grow up in that environment. Liv is going to grow up in an environment where, of course, she can vote. Of course, she assumes she's going to have equal access to opportunities in school. She's going to grow up in an environment where she can be whatever she wants to be. She's going to grow up in an environment of 50 people that have different opinions that are still respectful to each other. She's going to get these values of Hannah Marie Sandberg and Niels Albert Olson passed on to her. And I don't know what battle Liv will have in her life. 20 years from now, 30 years from now, she'll be taking the next step to push America one more time to realize our dream of fairness and opportunity so that every American, regardless of your religion or your race, or whether you're rich or whether you're poor, or whether you have a disability or you don't, or that every American is going to have the same opportunity to go out and prove themselves and express these values. That's the world that Liv will inherit because of the decades of work that have gone before her and the decades of work we still have to do. We're an unfinished business in America. I think we're the greatest country on earth, which is why that moment when those men in uniform handed my mom the American flag is one of the most sacred moments of my life. But even though I think America's a great country, doesn't mean I think we're finished. We got work to do to continue to push for fairness and inclusiveness for everybody. Thank you.
A big thank you to Greg Carr for his opening remarks and welcome. I'm pleased now to introduce today's panel. Each panelist will say a few words about civility, and then we will turn to questions from our audience. First, I'd like to introduce Kelley Packer. Kelley is the Executive Director of the Idaho Association of Cities. She's a former state representative and, of course, co-host of the Boise Metro Chamber's In Search of Civility series. Kelley, welcome.
Thank you, Katherine. It's an honor to be here today, to be able to participate in these important discussions with such a phenomenal panel. I'm excited to be here and for us to be able to take some time together and encourage everyone that's listening to actually seek out civility. It's such an important topic. As you mentioned, I am the Executive Director of the Association of Idaho Cities, and prior to that, I had the honor of serving in Governor Brad Little's administration. Prior to that, I actually served in the legislature, and I've also served as a city council member in my old hometown of McCammon, Idaho. During all of these years of service in this capacity, it has become apparent that we're hurting as a nation and as a state, and that there's some work to be done when it comes to working with each other and understanding each other and reaching across the table in friendship. When I was in the legislature, the leadership at that time, the pro tem and the speaker, brought in the National Institute of Civil Discourse, Next Generation, to help us with seeking respectful conversations and in getting to know each other and working on civility as a legislature, because we were going through some pretty tough times during that particular session and actually a lot since then. And during that, I learned some very important tools to help me be a better legislator and to be better at working with my colleagues so that we could represent our districts in a more thoughtful manner. And so much so that I became really interested in their mission and all that they we're doing across the nation to help legislators with this important topic. And I reached out to them and became a facilitator, where I was able to go and provide these same trainings in other states in the year of 2018. And I have done that many times since, and in fact, have the honor of sitting as a co-chair for the Next Generation group during this year and next year. We've got to focus on how to normalize hard conversations. Everything from diversity and inclusion to transportation and infrastructure funding. We have a responsibility to be more thoughtful and more courteous and respectful in the dialogues that we have at all levels, from the locals all the way up to Capitol Hill in DC. We have a responsibility as representatives of this great state and nation and our local jurisdictions to actually try to understand not just the issues, but the individual stakeholders that have the expertise and knowledge about the issues that we're talking about. We have a responsibility to those that elected us to office to try to find the very best solutions. And we're not going to do that if we are too committed to being right, or if we're closed-minded and unwilling to have conversations with people that might have different views than ours. The only way to improve and to better understand is to reach out in the hopes of actually growing and learning so that we can make more thoughtful decisions and bring better solutions overall. We need to set aside the divided nature that has been growing in not just Idaho, but across our nation, and work individually. I'm individually responsible for myself, and each of us are, to try to humanize discussions and to find a better way forward, a better way to love our neighbors, understand our neighbors, and help our neighbors. And with that, Katherine, I'll turn it back to you so that we can hear from some of our other panelists as well.
Thank you so much, Kelley, for sharing those thoughts with us today. I'd like to introduce our next panelist, Dr. Paulina Long-Gate. She is founder and executive director of the Idaho Museum of International Diaspora. Dr. Louangketh.
Great. Thank you so much, Katherine. Good afternoon, everyone. I too echo Kelley's sentiment and remarks, and I'm so grateful and humbled to be here with all of you today and participating on this phenomenal panel of amazing speakers. So as the founder and executive director of the Idaho Museum of International Diaspora, you're probably wondering what that is, right? So this is a specialty museum with none like it in the world. So we are pioneering this endeavor here in Idaho. And it is, if you think about it, this is really Idaho's emerging multi-purpose, multicultural museum on steroids. It's not only a museum, but it's a community center for local, national, and international visitors to learn about the human journey stories from around the world, for them to discover their own personal connections, and then also to explore how to be an active part of the community and relevant topics like what we're talking about today. And through opportunities through the museum's educational, cultural programs, no matter where they live, local, national, or international. And so with that said, I also teach at Boise State. I'm a professor of multicultural studies. And because of the museum, I actually designed a global diaspora curriculum in which I've taught at Boise State Honors College. And they are cross-cultural voices of diaspora, cross-border voices of diaspora, and cross-culinary voices of diaspora. What better way to bring a diverse group of people, of students together than through the neutral narrative, the neutral perspectives of food, right? And so my hope is to elevate the next generation of leaders, elevate their level of emotional intelligence, but also in cultural intelligence as well. I recently just got back last month from Spain. I was invited to speak at an international conference with political, private sector, government sector dignitaries from 12 countries. There were 40 countries represented in Spain and the Basque Country, and my platform was diaspora in the 21st century from the lens of the museum, the Idaho Museum of International Diaspora. And so that was a fascinating experience as the speakers, their platforms collectively was on Diaspora, which is the involuntary displacement of peoples from their origin homelands in past and current context. So for many of you, your ancestors from Europe, and then current context, today's immigrants, today's refugees. But also cultural diplomacy and public diplomacy as well. So I'm originally from Laos, born in Laos, but because of the Vietnam era conflict, my family and I escaped, we fled for our lives. And we ended up here in Idaho. And so I am originally from Laos as a former refugee, but a solid Idahoan. My family and I have been embraced by Idahoans. And so through the museum, I'm hoping to give the gift of gratitude and help to raise voices of different stories, human journey stories. And together we can really shift in how we influence positive changes in our community. Thank you.
Loo-on-gate, thanks so much for your opening remarks, sharing those perspectives. I'd like to introduce now our next panelist, Bill Manny. Bill is a producer at Idaho Public Television. He's former City Club of Boise president and host of City Club of Boise's Civility project, which took place in 2016. Bill.
Hi, Katherine. Thanks for having me. I guess I would, in the years that I've been involved in civil dialogue projects, I've worked with not just with City Club, but with Boise State, with the National Institute for Civil Discourse, with the Idaho Humanities Council. We at Idaho Public TV are working on a civic education project right now, and hopefully putting together a project with the Institute for Advancing American Values at Boise State. I guess I should also say, as a lifelong journalist, I think the media have a lot of accounting to do. I think we've contributed to some of this problem, and we can get into that in the question and answer. But I guess I come away from all this work with the conclusion that when we're talking about civil dialogue, I think we've misplaced the emphasis on civil instead of on dialogue. And I think we have to begin the dialogue before we can expect people to become civil. And research shows that if you get to know a refugee, you have a much more realistic view of that refugee as a person and not as a stereotype. And the resistance and fear goes down accordingly. And people who have had interactions with reporters, even when the reporter made a mistake, those people are more likely to be empathetic and sympathetic to that reporter as a human being who's just trying to do a good job and just trying to get it right, instead of as a stereotype or, an enemy of the people. So, how do we find more ways for people to interact with each other and get to know each other as human beings, flawed and as imperfect as we are, but human beings who are trying to do the best for ourselves and our family and our community? And how do we see each other as human beings instead of labels or stereotypes? So I would say, in wrapping up my comments, I think that is our great challenge. The great challenge of our time is finding ways for us to stop labeling and stereotyping each other and start getting to know each other as human beings. And that's where we can find resolution and reconciliation and move on from this place where we are in society today.
Bill, thank you. Thank you for enriching the conversation this afternoon. I'm going to turn to our final panelist now, Monica Church. Monica is a teacher in the Boise Public School District. She is a member of the City of Boise Ethics Commission and the Frank Church Institute and Andrews Center boards. Monica, thanks so much for joining.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to everybody else on the panel. I really appreciate what Bill said about the importance of dialogue, and I wanted to open up and talk a little bit about civil discourse, the dialogue component of it, and civility in Boise area high schools. But before I did that, I wanted to just take a moment and emphasize the importance of civic engagement historically as part of a free and appropriate public education. I think from the beginning, the democratic communities place importance on public education as a tool for teaching children the value of a free society, and maybe more specifically, how to participate appropriately in that society. In the United States, these schools became training grounds for new Americans, teaching democratic ideals necessary for participating in representative democracy. So I think if we were to believe the words of the founding fathers and the documents that they left behind, and political minds, both past and present, representative democracy is only as strong as the civil society organizations that we have, some of which the panelists spoke to already. And I think a lot of that is fostered in part by a universal education system. And I think learning to engage with people and participate in shaping public opinion is really at the heart of the goal of public schools. But in developing these public opinions and putting your ideas on the political agenda is really difficult. And it requires that students be taught opposing viewpoints. And recognizing multiple perspectives, finding common ground, I think is a true value of public education. And so if we accept the premise of this discussion and agree, with the great political theorist Robert Putnam that civility is on the decline in the United States and is in turn deteriorating democratic legitimacy, then a quality public education that mandates standards of critical thinking and thoughtful dialogue might just be the best way to strengthen civility. So to tie to Greg's question in the beginning, how can we bring Idaho together? For me, the answer is simply invest in our public schools. So now to speak just very briefly about civility in the Boise public schools, I have to start by saying there's no better team of educators and staff than the Boise Independent School District. Our high schools, Boise, Bora, Capitol, Timberline, and Frank Church, are excellent at preparing young people to be critical thinkers and have the civility necessary for both higher learning and careers. And I think one of the easiest parts for me preparing for this panel was communicating with my colleagues. We certainly are a network of educators who are actively working together to meet the needs of our communities, the state of Idaho, and the country as a whole. So just briefly, what does civility look like in the classroom here in the Boise school system? I just want to put forward a couple of ideas. So Tegan Carter at Capitol uses a tiered approach. A great example of this is the use of rubrics and parameters she has to build speaking and listening skills. It always culminates in an in-depth philosophical chair debate on hot topic issues. And I have to say that I have used this hot topic seminar routine of hers many times in the past and in the present. Karen Moss at Timberline spends time creating established norms. She uses the approach of looking at media literacy in order to create balance and fairness in the classroom. Amy Hutchinson at Boise and Boise Online Schools uses primary sources and to lay objective truths as a foundation for civility and discussion. And Kyle McMorrow, also at Boise High, presents current events in a formulaic fashion to build consistency in interpreting difficult topics. I talked to Janet Liston over at Frank Church, and she uses a community resilience model to prepare students socially and emotionally for difficult discussions. And then last, Corinne Rue at Bora. I think that woman never sleeps. She builds more standards-based curriculum, critical thinking curriculum than anyone I know. And she certainly epitomizes what it means to be a 21st century educator. Now, finally, none of these things are revolutionary. In fact, every teacher does them. And I think that's the point I want to get across about strengthening civility. Our teachers are professionals and they've been educated and well-trained to navigate difficult conversations. And so to bridge the divide that Greg spoke about in the intro, I think we need to look no further than to our public school teachers for guidance. And then lastly, and I'll be done, I think I was brought on to this panel to be the hope panelist to speak to the next generation. And I do have hope. I have a lot of it. The Idaho value of civil service is on full display in Boise high schools. The co-chairs of the Mayor's Climate Council are students at Timberline and Capitol. The founders of Idaho Asian American Pacific Islander Youth Alliance is a student at Boise. The organizers of the Idaho Women's March have, since its creation and every year since, been students at Boise, Bora, and Capitol. Students from all 5 high schools sit on the AAUW's Youth Board for voter registration. Frank Church produces exceptional Rotary scholars. Capitol and Boise students organize the Young Women in Leadership Conference at the Andrus Center. Students in the Boise School District participate in the Frank Church Conference. They participate in the U.S. Senate Youth Program, the Boise Committee on Foreign Relations, City Club. They serve as board members, legislative pages, and legislative interns. And they use their voices to advocate for things like saving wild salmon and making Idaho more inclusive. And finally, the fact is, you know many of these students, you see them, you hear them, you read their work, and they should give us all hope that while fragile, certainly, civility is not dead, certainly not in Boise public schools. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Monica. Thank you to all of our panelists for your opening remarks. Before we turn to audience questions, I am going to remind our radio audience that you're listening to the virtual conversation Striving for Civility in Fractured Times, presented in partnership with City Club of Boise, Boise Metro Chamber of Commerce, Association of Idaho Cities, and Smith+Malek Law Firm. So Kelley, I'm going to turn to you first. People are really interested in the National Institute of Civil Discourse. How does the Institute work? Is it active in Idaho? Maybe talk a little bit more about how it engages with different legislatures around the country.
Super. Next Generation is under the National Institute of Civil Discourse umbrella. And that program is specifically designed to work with state legislatures on creating more civil environments within their state and among their legislators. It has not been back to Idaho, to my knowledge, and I have been involved since the training that we had in our legislature here. Because the Next Generation program is an invitation type program. The leadership in each state has the opportunity to invite us to participate, and we do outreach to states, encouraging that. But we don't come into a state unless the leadership invites us in to work with their caucus, the House and Senate members that they want to have us do a training for. So that becomes a little bit difficult, but our goal is overall to encourage all legislatures to bring us in, especially during freshman orientation, so that we can bring a different perspective to the discussions that are going to happen within the walls of their capitals. One of the things that we do in our training is we humanize each other. We talk about personal journeys. We talk about some of the things that mold us as individuals, why we have developed the value systems that we have. And we recognize that we can have very similar circumstances that create very different results. But it creates an environment where the legislators understand each other a little bit better and they see each other as individuals. I don't remember which of the panelists, or if it was Greg, that mentioned that it's really hard to hate someone or be cruel to someone that you see as a human, an individual, just like yourself. And so that is probably the core to our training, is getting them to see each other as another human being with the same type of hopes and dreams and experience and skills and knowledge set, that you'll hopefully, they will hopefully take the time to then engage more with each other and to think before they speak. How is what I'm going to say or what I've crafted going to be perceived by someone that's very different than me in maybe a value or a party or so forth? Because where it's most important, we're really all the same. We want to be loved. We want to be understood. We want to have security. We want to have food and water and clean air, and we want to be safe, etc. So the elements that are most important to the human race, we are all very, very similar, if not the exact same. We do have different experiences, knowledge and skill sets, value systems, etc. But that doesn't make us evil, just makes us different. And so we need to take the time to get to know each other as people so that we can, like I said before, normalize these hard conversations. The last thing that I will say about NICD and the importance of the work that they do and that's happening here and that many others are doing is that civility is not meant to silence a voice or opinion. In fact, it's meant to do just the opposite. It's meant to encourage dialogue, as Bill Manny was mentioning. It is to encourage those discussions so that we can better understand, and in the crux of understanding, hopefully find the right solutions for all of the people that we are responsible for representing or taking care of. And that can be in a neighborhood association. That could just be even between neighbors. We need to reach out and help and love like we all used to be taught in the Golden Rule.
Thank you, Kelley, for saying more about the National Institute for Civil Discourse. Paulina, I'm going to turn to you next. So in the opening, Greg Carr spoke about this idea of unfinished business, that there may be something on which we can all agree, but we're just not quite there yet. And if you could talk a little bit more about how does that connect to civility? Draw the arc for us.
Yeah, thank you so much, Katherine. I think Kelley touched on many elements that help with that connection, right? And so Greg talked about a set of core values that resonated within his family, but also true to Idahoans. He talked about self-reliance, compassion, hard work, service, but also fairness. And this unfinished business is we're humans. So we make mistakes and we argue and we fight. But in order to strive towards civility, right, and Kelley put this beautifully, meant to encourage dialogue, is we also have to seek out and connect with our neighbors or our communities. And connecting that requires us to open up ourselves, right? Show a little bit of our vulnerabilities and share our stories. And Kelley had also talked about that as well, the personal journeys of us individually, but of us as a community as well. And so I think that stories really do help to connect people in special ways. You have to get to them at the level of thinking, right? How do we connect with them? And you have to have that open dialogue. So that starts with the head, in order for our hearts to be settled and to embrace the diversity and the differences that we see and experience with each other. And, it starts with a little bit of our background, and our background involves our culture, whether that's the American culture, whether that's the Southeast Asian culture or the African culture. There's a culture. And if you're a single family unit, you have a specific culture there, and it's sharing a little bit of that. It, again, humanizes us, like what Kelley says. And I think this work needs to be continual. We need to seek where there is differences in understanding and try to meet each other where we're at, and allow pauses, allow space, but also allow the time for the relationship to flourish, if you will, and then continue to foster that relationship and continue to invite your neighbors, whether they're your neighbors that you already have a relationship with or whether they're strangers, but continually invite that open dialogue and approach it in a way with the assumption that everybody has good intentions. Thank you.
Thank you, Paulina, for drawing that arc for us. Bill, I'm moving through the panel in the order you're introduced, and I'm going to ask you a little bit more about the 2016 Civility Project, and if there was a big takeaway or an aha moment for you during that project, and how does that connect to today? I mean, so many people think about 2016 and they say, gosh, it was so long ago. Things have really intensified since then. So if you could talk a little bit about that, that would be appreciated.
Well, I certainly don't think the evidence would show we haven't done much to eliminate incivility in our society. 2016, we had a series of projects. It was the themes of City Club's forums for a year. We had a kickoff event. We had a couple different public events. We had a summit that had citizens, leaders, and journalists trying to cross that divide. We met with other nonprofits and like-minded organizations, how we could all work together. I'm not sure you could say we've made a huge amount of progress, but we began the conversation. Kelley talked about the NICD work in Idaho. Idaho was the very first legislature that year, as a result of kind of getting NICD to come to the state, to do the civil dialogue training for every member of the legislature, the first legislature in the country to do that for every member. And that was thanks to the leadership. And out of that, not just Kelley Packer, but Melissa Wintrow and Chuck Winder became ambassadors and trainers that have been around the country working on these projects. Brent Hill, the former Senate president for a time, was a leader with the NICD. And of course, Keith Allred, who is an Idaho boy and former candidate for governor, among other things, is now the executive director for the NICD. So I think you can make a case that Idaho has been really at the forefront of working with this organization, trying to make progress on these issues. Now, my great takeaway, I guess I would agree with Greg Carr on 2 points. I'm very sad at the way things are today. There's a lot of work to be done. I agree with that. I think that the great takeaway from all of our events was that we need training that begins not just in high school and certainly not in college, but something that's in junior highs and elementary school. And it's not just civics. It's not when was George Washington president or when was the Civil War. It's a civic literacy where you have to know how your government works, but you also have to know how to be a smart consumer of information, how to know when you're being manipulated, how to know how to be a good citizen. And I really echo Monica's comments on the work that's being done in our schools, and cannot emphasize the work, the conclusion we reached as a group in 2016, that it's got to start with our kids.
Bill, thanks for talking about 2016 project and really what you're seeing today and thinking about even younger than high school. Monica, a question for you. You are in the Boise School District. You work with students through student council, through student government, and you've worked with many years of students at this point. So people are really interested, how do the high school students internalize this comment? You know, they're on social media, they're chatting with each other, they're taking in the news. How do they internalize this? What does civility really look like to them? Is this something they get? Are they struggling with it? If you could paint that picture, it'd be great.
Yeah, I mean, that's a loaded question. How do students feel about civility? I think that the term civility, you have to define it for them. And certainly in the Boise schools, civility is that civic engagement. And so practicing civility is something that they have done since kindergarten. I would say that, you know, at least here, I see civility being practiced at a much younger level. I have a daughter who is a sixth grader, and I know that they practice these, you know, the same type of things I talked about earlier. But as far as civility in the high school, students see it as their participation. Now, we are seeing more of the board members and joining on to different groups, whether it's the Idaho Conservation League or the Trail Association, rather than kind of the protests of a couple of years ago, but both are very valid and students find them both very valuable. And, you know, here at Boise High, you see students participating in what they see as their civil duty, you know, not being eligible to vote yet. By door knocking, by, you know, getting out the vote, by joining with campaigns, candidates, political parties, by protesting, you know, by going to the Capitol building, writing to the Idaho Statesman or the Press Tribune. You know, many of them have had their work published here in the last, you know, couple of months, especially about the Columbia Basin Initiative. You know, we had Mike Simpson actually here on campus just a couple of months ago thanking the students for their civic engagement. And those are the kind of things that they see when we talk about civility, you know, rather than what was civility in 1830. They are really concerned about how they can make this place better, maybe even outside of the scope of the Idaho legislature or U.S. Congress. So, thanks for the question.
Yeah, thanks, Monica. You know, you're bringing other terms into this conversation: civility, civil discourse, civic engagement. So I think it's really helpful to understand the vernacular that we should be using and how young people see this may be different than that, like that pedagogy, that term itself. And I think this is a great connection to a question for Paulina. Paulina, you know, we talk about civility, and I think some of us naturally consider maybe that's something government should model, and maybe others of us say it should be taught in the school. Is this for governments, businesses, schools, public life, private life? You know, where is civility really important?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question, and I'm so glad that you asked that. I think we as a society, individually, as a community, in all sectors, industry sectors, public, private, etc., the list goes on, right? We are all accountable, and it starts with us as humans. You know, Greg Carr had talked about the examples and the stories of his family. And what resonated with me was modeling of that behavior for the next generation. And in an earlier conversation, we talked about the next generation, right? This is it. We are with the next generation of our future leaders. And so if we don't influence their mental model, if you will, or their way of thinking earlier on, it's going to be a struggle. It's going to be an uphill battle. And so if we can model exemplary behavior as good citizens of our community and show them the way of how we can have a civil discourse, a civil dialogue with our neighbors in the workplace setting, in church, at community gatherings, I think that we are on the trajectory of something that will continually foster this desired state of acting more civil on various topics, right? And coaching our younger generations of how does one even absorb complex emotional topics, and how does one then formulate their way of thinking it through in a way that reduces that level of emotion to try to understand what the other one is trying to say. And so again, this is when I'm teaching cross-cultural voices of diaspora, cross-border voices of diaspora, my aim is to elevate my students' level of emotional intelligence, putting oneself in the place of the other, the deliverer of the message, and trying to understand and navigate what they're feeling, so that way you can have a more civil discourse, a civil dialogue. And it's just so important that we who've been trained in this particular area, or who know better, right, that continue to model and coach that behavior to the next generation. And the next generation could simply be the high school students or the college students, or even our colleagues, even to our own leaders, right, of how we would approach sensitive, delicate topics.
Thank you, Paulina. Kelley, I'm gonna ask a question, and then we're gonna turn quickly to final comments from the group. So Kelley, hopefully you have a succinct answer to this one, which is, with so many pressing problems, challenges facing the US, facing the world right now, why should we focus on civility?
It's the only way forward. You cannot have good conversations and find real solutions if you're not willing to seek out differing views. Differing views have been evilized. I don't know if that's not even a word, but differing views should not equal evil, and different people should not equal enemies, right? We should be actively seeking to understand and to find those people so that we do understand. No one person is a know-all, end-all to any discussion or situation or need or issue. And therefore, the more at the table, the better our solutions and long-term results will be.
Thank you, Kelley. Okay, so a lightning round to close this conversation today. Panelists, if you have final thoughts about civility, something that you wanted to be asked but it wasn't covered, if you have a resource for those listening today, it's a podcast, a great book, a video, please weave that in, and we have about 90 seconds. I think Bill raised his hand. Bill, go.
I really like Paulina's point about, we're all accountable for this. And I'm noticing the very first comments we got on the chat, someone said, asking for civility, is this a joke? And then someone else said, exactly. And you know what? I'm skeptical too, right? We're all skeptical. But if we don't ask ourselves and each other to own this problem, we're not going to make any progress. And if we don't enter into every interaction and every conversation in a spirit of goodwill and with an open mind, how can we expect anyone else to enter into it with that same sense? So in conclusion, I would say stop being part of the problem. Stop demonizing, stop labeling, stop liking mean tweets and smart alecky posts. Delete those platforms that are on your phone that are profiting from the polarization and are poisoning our conversation, right? Be the change you want to see in the world. Now, that's not a solution, but it's got to be the first step for all of us if we want to make a difference.
Thanks, Bill. I'm going to call on you, Monica.
Well, I mean, I guess I would say that my final thought is very similar to my first thought, and that is I'm going to use Bill's civil literacy, and that civil literacy starts in the schools. So if we want to increase civility, then the number one way we do that is we support our public schools, and we support our public schools not only by volunteering and being a part of them, but also reaching out to the legislature and our delegation at the national level and asking them to support public schools.
Thank you, Monica. Paulina.
Well, thank you again, everyone, for just your contributions. I have so many wonderful takeaways from our conversation, but also from the comments that have been provided. But I think my biggest message would be active, right? Don't, if you're receiving negative input, negative comments, invite that dialogue, and you would be surprised at how much you can impact positive changes.
Thank you for the invitation, Paulina. And finally, Kelley.
Thank you again for this opportunity. I have hope. I'm excited about the conversation we've had here, both as panelists, but also in the comments section. And I would just echo what Terry Tate, I think it's Macaulay said in the comment, and that funny thing is, it feels good to be nice. Let's get back to the golden rule and loving one another.
Thank you so much for being part of the panel today. Thanks to our audience for joining us. And I hope that you have a wonderful and very civil afternoon.
Thanks, Kathy.